So welcome back. This is the Research Challenges panel, the panel number 6 of 7 today. And we have, as usual, 4 panelists, 2 of whom you've met before. Let me go from the far side, Bartel van der Walle, Leysia Palen,
very good. Sorry, hard name.
Robin Murphy, and David Ferguson. We have a number of items that I want to draw your attention to. One is the very excellent paper, background paper that Ryan put together for this meeting. And on page 5, you'll find a whole page on potential research challenges. And it's very wide-ranging. I think it has some excellent suggestions. And so that's perhaps something you might want to scan as we go through this, if you haven't already. The other is this list, which appeared while you were having coffee, which is, again, a list again put together by Ryan. This is a list of 15 topics. Not all of them are directly research related, but they are all topics which we would like you to think about prioritizing from your own personal perspective during the meeting. You can think of this perhaps as homework for this evening. We would like them back tomorrow because there will be some analysis done, and you will, of course, be welcome to change your opinion later if you like. You may notice also that at the bottom there is a line, fill in the space, for your own personal item which you might want to see prioritized. If you would like, in addition to this rather antiquated communication medium, if you would like to tweet your suggestion to DG2G, by all means do. That may be a more effective way of getting it on the record. So just a couple of comments to start. I see this as a phenomenon which has been, to a large extent, technology-driven. Twitter is a technology. Flickr is a technology. Those technologies have had massive impacts, as I'm sure we'd all recognize. The research community's role has been way back in the lower layers of the technologies. It's possible to trace many, many developments which led eventually to these technologies. But at the same time, the research community clearly has a new role to play now that the technology is having its impact. There are issues of the applications that the user community is coming up with. There are issues of improving the technology in the next round, questions of where the impediments lie to better use of the technology that might be removed by research. I think we've heard already today many, many examples of how these issues of research fall into the social sciences. Political science, communication, social psychology, as well obviously as in computer science, as well as in geography perhaps, as well as in areas of machine learning, artificial intelligence, because in the time-critical environment of an emergency, it's clear that as much as possible of the analysis, synthesis, simple processing of the inputs is going to have to be done in a semi-automated fashion. How best to balance the role of the human and the role of the computer, I think is a major research question for this community. What we're asking you to do, and what we're asking the panelists to do in the next few minutes, is to think about the research agenda for the next perhaps 5 to 10 years, where society should be investing in research, which agencies should be investing, at what level should they be investing in terms of quantity of research investment. I think we'd all agree that these are all important questions and that it's important that we guide the future through combination of research, development, and other activities. So if we could think perhaps more in the future than in the past or the present, I think that would provide an appropriate setting for this session. So we're going to go down the panel, starting with Dave, and the kinds of questions that we're asking the panelists to address are in your program. Social media, crowdsourcing, and other open innovations create new and unsolved research challenges around issues as wide-ranging as pattern recognition, validation, visualization, cybersecurity. What is the state of the art? What problems have various groups identified as the research agenda for the next 5 to 10 years? So we'll follow the usual pattern of an approximately 5-minute discussion by the panelist, and then we'll open it up for general discussion, general questions and comments from the audience and from the wire. So without more ado, Dave.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be with you today, and for Eric for tapping me on the shoulder and saying, get my ass over here.
With endless respect.
Let me put my comments into perspective. I'm from the Science and Technology Office at USAID. Shadrock Roberts, who you heard from earlier, is part of the GEO Center that's in the Science and Technology Office. We are relatively new at the agency, but we are really focused on how to use science and technology to improve development outcomes and how to open the agency. And so I think that's really where the discussions that I've heard so far here today are really playing into the kind of strategies that we're taking. And I hope to learn from the work that you all are doing in emergency response and apply it on a very different time scale of years as opposed to hours, right, around development outcomes. We are about connecting the grassroots with government, right, but on a longer time scale. In the development community, there are far more actors today, more players, more people interested and willing to contribute. We need to tap into that. Technology is giving us access to beneficiaries and development workers and solutions providers that we never had before. And so we're trying to figure out, so how do we tap into that? How do we deploy that, right, to help us with these long-term, really knotty development problems? And ultimately, our goal here is not to find an innovation. It's to find scalable solutions that we deploy at scale. If we're not impacting millions of people's lives, we're not doing our job. So my responsibility is to run a program called Grand Challenges for Development. This is an effort that we started in 2010. We launched our first Grand Challenge for Development in March of 2011. We're about to launch our fourth in December. A Grand Challenge for Development. This is a term that we have coined because grand challenges are everywhere. And so they mean, I'm sure if I asked you what a grand challenge for development was, we'd get many different answers. So let me tell you the way AID is framing this problem. The first and most important point is that we need to start by being incredibly articulate about the problem and not being presumptuous about the solution. By doing so, we should be able to activate all of these actors that we've talked about by being clear about what we're trying to solve, right? That we can bring more new ideas into the game. 2, science and technology has to play a role in knocking down some of the barriers. 3, we always implement with partners, right? The most important reason is because we need to model the behavior we think that will be required to solve these knotty development problems. We have to bring significant funds to the table, and we have to engage the globe in the solution quest, right? That's crowdsourcing. That's catalyzing global action is the phrase that we use. All right, so that's it. 5 things, right, to make a grand challenge for development. Right? They are very focused, specific problems like saving lives at birth, focusing on women and neonates in rural low-resource settings around the 48 hours of birth. All children reading, right? That we just had a big celebration of our first round of grants to 32 organizations focused on how can we bring science and technology to bear on kids that get 3 years of formal education but can't read. Not an acceptable outcome. All right? Education access for all, the Millennium Development Goal, was not meant to be let's get kids in schools and we're done. It was meant, right, to yield educated kids. All right, so we're focusing on reading. Powering agriculture, an energy grand challenge around the nexus of energy and agriculture, and the one that we're working on now with partners that we hope to launch in December that has some relevance here to what we're talking about is making all voices count, connecting citizens and governments for better governance outcomes. So this approach, this grand challenge for development approach, is different for AID. Right? Our primary mode of operation is to get on the ground, see what the problems are, decide how we might be able to effectively influence that problem, program some funds to go after that. This approach is much more open and collaborative and meant to engage a much broader audience in identifying what those solutions will be. Our administrator, we heard some discussion earlier about the importance of senior management support. Our administrator, Dr. Rajah, gave a speech on August 1st that I want to roughly quote from. It was dubbed the open source development speech. All right, and it is focused around these points: empowering more people everywhere to tackle development problems. USAID, I can't even read my own handwriting, must create a platform that connects the world's biggest development challenges to development problem solvers. We are shifting the agency from designing and implementing projects to being a connector. So I've heard that scattered throughout the discussion here today. All right? Raj sees that. Raj understands the platform that USAID can create to help facilitate that. Doesn't mean we're going to change what aid does overnight. This is something that we're adding to the portfolio of things that we're going to do. So I very much appreciate the ideas and thoughts that I've heard here today, and look forward to the comments from the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much. Robin?
Howdy, I'm Robin Murphy. That's the official Texas A&M greeting, by the way. It's in my faculty contract. All right, very good, in the back. Texas A&M is very unusual for a lot of reasons, and one is that we are the state agency for urban search and rescue, and we are home to Texas Task Force 1, both the state and FEMA teams, and it has about 200 acres of experimental facilities in the world, so that makes us very unique. My background is as a computer science professor and a boots-on-the-ground responder, having been in 15 deployments with robots, starting with the World Trade Center, and most recently assisting with Fukushima and leading 2 teams for the tsunami. And what I want to do today is address the issue of funding, particularly from National Science Foundation funding. And I co-chaired a workshop on computing for disasters by the Computing Community Consortium, which is basically a think tank sponsored by the National Science Foundation to look through what the community is thinking and make recommendations for funding. And this is essentially the research agenda. And a very good workshop. I'd like to, Leysia was on it, as was Eric Rasmussen. So you can see that the big purpose up here on the slide is that from the computer science perspective, the computer science community see that it's all about decision making for extremes, under extremes, whether you're a formal stakeholder in this process or an informal stakeholder. That's what we're looking for. And traditionally, the types of information that we've got, we've heard a lot about this today, and so I think this is, very relevant for this. As computer scientists, though, we see even more complexity, more research topics, reliability, uncertainty, probabilistic models, how we're keeping that infrastructure, both the networking, the bandwidth, how we can make these algorithms faster, where's all that data going? Some of the barriers that you've already begun to run up against, these are fundamental issues in our community. But they're not necessarily new issues for us, but it turns out we believe that this is actually quite different than just make a better network or just solve whatever the security and privacy problem is. What makes it different are 3 things. One is the extreme scale. There's extreme time scales. Things either happen very, very fast. You need to respond within an hour, the golden hour, 12 hours for the initial response decision time, 2 to 10 years, sometimes 10 years if you're lucky on the recovery. So what kind of time spans are you working over? What spatial, the spatial scales that we have to work over, the number of stakeholders and the diversity of the stakeholders, and the data itself. We're very good as a community about data mining when it's things coming to us like in Amazon or what we're giving away for free on Facebook, right? We're good, but that's very structured. And the rest of it gets much harder, and you're already talking about it with the filtering and how do you pull that together. So these are things that we're looking at. The second thing is the extreme complexity. From an algorithmic perspective, a disaster is a nonlinear, highly large interdependency type of problem. And so the physicists actually call this a wicked problem because you can solve it once and it makes no difference because the starting conditions on the next one means, you know, it's a totally different problem. So we've got extreme complexity. The algorithms have to run at high order of complexity, which means very fast over large scales. The modeling is uncertain, and it's all about resilience because none of this will work if we don't have the resilient infrastructure and the resilient algorithms and the resilient people, right? Which is the third part. It's really a human system problem. It's humans and computers working together to pull that together. And that's something that all of the sciences, we're very good at our individual part, but when we get to the systems integration, it's quite a challenge. So those are the three areas that we've seen that makes this in computer science difference. What we're looking at for the National Science Foundation to fund as a major research initiative, creating a living roadmap that will be connected with the stakeholders. That another aspect of this domain is that we just can't do it as computer scientists in our lab. We actually have to engage with the stakeholders, both informal and formal. We're saying you should not be funded if you don't have a meaningful partnership. And so it's holistic research. It's going to have to be, and that was interesting to me, we're actually moving toward empirical methodologies. As everyone's trying to get more quantitative metrics, we're seeing that some of these metrics have to be measured in a different way because they're small-scale, non-reproducible events. How the heck are we going to get the usual P's that we're used to on the statistics there? And again, the meaningful partnership with stakeholders. So that's a little bit of background about us, and I hope that contributes to the agenda.
Thank you. Leysia.
Okay, Leysia Palen, University of Colorado, Director of Project EPIC. So as you know, it's really hard to imagine what things are going to look like 5 to 10 years out, especially in the kind of changing world that we're in this particular problem domain. I think there's some basic stuff that I'd like just to get on the table and then share with you how I myself imagine what things will be like in that time frame. So I'll use a device to help me get there. So some basic stuff that I think that we've more or less said, but I think it's worth stating for the record, is that we're learning a lot now about how to derive information from the social media streams, but we're not very good yet at sort of cobbling it all back together and delivering it to and making it meaningful for the right micro audiences, as I like to think of them, because we have very micro audiences in disaster response. Something that I reacted to during the panel about the veracity of crowdsourced information was one thing that we don't pay a lot of attention to, but I think we all still know this is very important, is the matter of the absence of reported information. So just as we know that a lot of people reporting on one thing might not mean that that is more true than something else, we also don't know we don't have very good methods for dealing yet with the absence of information. So how do we know that we're getting the right representativeness of information that we need to get? So that's kind of those are things I just want to put on the table. So then I want to offer you kind of this thought device that I use to think about where we're going to go in the next 5 or 10 years. So I would like to say that what I want to do actually is move the idea of social media as this big looming thing, and I want to take it as this foreground problem that we're wrestling as we wrestle with it now, and push it into the background, way into the background. And I think by doing that, we can get further ahead. So I think it will let us, so what I want to do is I want to let the problems of emergency management come to the fore and be our foreground concern. This follows very much on what Robin just offered us as well. If we do that, I believe that the resolution of the problems and prospects of social media, that we can resolve those things with the practices of emergency management, and they'll come much more swiftly. So what do I mean? So we know that social media enables a kind of convergence of people information. People are suddenly talking about things. Is it good? Is it bad? Lots of people coming to the virtual space that hadn't been there before around a particular event. Well, what if we rethought the implications of convergence onto the disaster site, and specifically the matter of social and informational convergence onto the geographical disaster site? So what if we made convergence our mainline concern for the moment? So I'd like to give you a real example that it's making me think along these lines. So when I was on site at the in Baton Rouge at the Louisiana headquarters for the American Red Cross in 2005, I was at the very beginning of my entry into this domain, and I was absolutely struck, dumbstruck by the thousands of volunteers moving in this warehouse of a location, rotating in and out on a 2-week basis, in a staggered fashion, realizing that they had to be flown into an area where it was really hard to get flights in. They had to be trained, fed, sheltered. They had to be treated medically sometimes themselves too, just basic triage, but they still had to have that service provided to them. And they had to be transported locally between the places they were trying to help and the shelters, and then back to headquarters. And this was during a time when all those things were ultra scarce for the victims themselves, never mind the people who were trying to help. So they're in this huge warehouse of a building. It was really a beautiful sight to behold, really absolutely stunning, because they had numerous paper maps up everywhere. They had complex arrays of sticky notes that were information systems trying to figure out who's in what shelters, what staff are in what shelters, what nurses are in what shelters, and so on. As a person who first studied before I moved into the disaster space, I first care about human coordination and technology-mediated coordination, and just human coordination in general, no matter how it's mediated. I thought it was a really incredible thing. But I also wondered, given how difficult it was for me to get in there alone, just one person, and for how hard it was for me to get around even Baton Rouge alone, I wondered, do all these people need to be physically on site to do all these pieces of work? And they themselves were not local to the area. Some were, I'm sure, but many were not, right? So I'm not sure they had the benefit in all cases of being local and knowing about the region, because they themselves were the headquarters for Louisiana and places beyond as well. And certainly, even if they knew about Baton Rouge and New Orleans, even if they knew that, in a post-disaster situation, they certainly don't know about the little towns and things all around the multi-city state area that they were trying to support. So I wondered is there any, what coordination and what amount of this work could be done remotely? Was the overhead of supporting those volunteers greater, and all those workers, volunteers or not, greater than the benefits of all those people being together? Even though I love face-to-face collaboration, I think it's really important. But was the overhead more beneficial than, how did it compare to the costs of the benefits of being together? So I think, can some of this be offloaded remotely? And I don't mean to other people, I mean maybe in that case to that organization itself. And so I'm guessing that the answer to this, that you might agree, is yes, maybe a partial and a qualified yes, and I think that's probably the way to interpret it. But if we could do that, if we could really help the institution of emergency management by thinking about how we can move work and push it off remotely, then we're on to something, right? And I'm sure there's many, I'm not trying to pick on the American Red Cross. I think it's a wonderful organization, and what I saw was incredibly inspirational. But I'm sure you have lots of examples in the whole ecosystem of emergency management where this might be the question. So then I think the question is, what can ICT and social computing as a new class of things that we can do with ICT do for emergency management as emergency management already exists? And then the next step is, and what and then what can it newly do for emergency management that emergency management can't do now? So instead of social media as a thing, foisting itself onto emergency management, and emergency management trying to awkwardly wiggle its way into or conform to what's happening, and it's a changing thing, and it's hard to explain because it's different every day, I think we can ask more clearly, absent of all the baggage that comes along with social media, we can ask instead, what is it about emergency management that can be supported by remote work? And I'm not qualifying who does it. It might be volunteers, it might be paid workers, it might be the trained professionals we already have. But I think that's the salient and bottom line question for me is how can we enable remote work? So then we go back to the research agenda issue. I'll say, now that we're dealing with, we might say, okay, let's start imagining those solutions. And then we can also implement them. But as a thought experiment and as a set of thought solutions, we might ask, well, given that we can do these things, what else can we do remotely? And I think that brings us back to social computing. Social media exists today, but also the functionality is what we really care about and how that might exist still in closed systems, some open systems and some closed systems. And I think it's that will help us drive the future of emergency management with advanced technology. Thank you.
Bartel.
Okay, following Leysia is never easy. I would like to make a few points about the topic of the panel, which is about the future. And I think it was Yogi Berra who said, prediction is very hard, especially about the future. I fully agree with that one. However, I think another interesting quote that I've heard from one of my first professors of information systems was, if we look at information technologies and information systems, we tend to look at the future, but we do that in a special way. We tend to walk backwards to the future. We look a lot back at what we already have, and we base ourselves on that, and we walk to the future, but we look backward way too much. Having said that, I think it's not bad to, from time to time, to really learn from what we already know, what has happened in the past. And one of my people that I keep reading, although what he published was in 1945, just before our time, I would assume for most of us, was Vannevar Bush. I don't know if I pronounced Vannevar correctly, even. I'm a European, pardon me. But he published an essay about how we may think, was the title. And there he was actually one of the first people who suggest that we would at some point arrive at a sort of an universal encyclopedia with lots of interconnected links that would lead from one thing to the other. And some of us see this as a sort of precursor of the web as we know it today. But what he also predicted is an information explosion. And what was missing, according to him, was a knowledge explosion that would go with that information explosion. And I think if you look at what's happening today, we're having a bit of a similar problem here. We do have an information explosion. There's no other word to describe it. But we're looking at, what could lead, or what could it be in terms of knowledge and knowledge explosion. And we should not think that this is an entirely new problem. Again, quoting Quarantelli, he provides another interesting perspective here in 1967. I'm moving along steadily. He says under conditions of stress, it's sociological, not technological factors that are responsible for impaired organizational response. And I think that's also still very much true. So we're focusing very much on social media and on the technology aspects in some cases. But we should not forget that it's where people and technology interact that we're having the most challenging opportunities. Having looked back at these things, I think we are indeed at the moment at challenging times. And the question that we as academics should ask ourselves is whether we can apply the models that we already always used and always been taught, if we can apply them directly into the situation that we're currently dealing with. I have looked at a number of models that have been proposed. One is the Cynefin model. It's Welsh. Is anybody Welsh here?
I'm not Welsh, but that's a great model.
It's a great model.
One
And
Wikipedia article.
oh, okay, good. And so it makes a distinction between, on the one hand, what is known and knowable, and that's where the scientific realm is. We do apply our scientific methods. If we think it's knowable, we apply it, and we bring it back to the known region or area. So we learn from that. That's where most of our physics experiments, where we discover the Higgs boson and things like that. Now, on the other hand, there's also an area where things are complex and chaotic, as he calls it in his model. And I think that's where many or none of the scientific models that we use are totally freely applicable as such. So we cannot just transfer the methods that we have there in the known and the knowable to the complex and the chaotic phase. And I think that's where we are struggling with. When we're trying, we're looking at what we do in crisis response, we are in the complex and chaotic phase, at least initially. And so still we're trying to figure out what's going on by using a lot of the methods that we always used in much more clear and well-defined scientific environments. So I would definitely expect in the future that we try to increasingly develop these techniques to this new environment and learn from that. Because lots of our learning, if we keep on applying things that we know, will lead us nowhere. And that's maybe the final point I want to make. I'm also president of ISCRAM. ISCRAM is an association that mostly brings together researchers. We add, as much as we can, practitioners. We invite practitioners to our meetings. We organize an annual conference where we're looking at state-of-the-art and current status of information systems in crisis management in general. We do have a social media track that is very much attended, and we always have great contributions from Leysia and Kay and others in the room here. But the main idea of ISCRAM is to bring together different communities from research, because even within research, there's no such thing as the research community. We're many different communities. So try to bring this together, try to have them talk among each other, bring in people from the field, whereas Gisli was there quite often, others who have experience in the field, and try to learn from them what's going on. You know, what are, oh, there he is, Gisli, you're watching online and you came back quickly, I know. So, because one of our, I think, and I share a bit that frustration with Gisli, I'm sure, is that we should step away from the what we do currently with lessons learned. I think we don't learn much from them. We identify lessons, but we relearn them again at the next disaster. And part of that is that we're missing serious research with the right methods, right techniques to change from lessons identified to lessons learned. So that is what I hope we can achieve in the next 5 to 10 years somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you for very interesting perspectives. I'm sure you'll agree. Let's go to audience and to the online world.
Hi, thank you, everybody. It's great to have so many esteemed academics in the field here. One thing in the practical application side of emergency management that I think sometimes obviously can be a disconnect between our communities is how do we take what things you are looking at and examining, and how do we turn that into something that's going to help us change operationally how we do things or decision-making processes. I came across an article, I think it came out of University of Jacksonville, about natural language processing in relation to taking a look at real-time, or looking at messages. But that's my question for you is there any research that's going on that can give us some actual tools that will help us differentiate and extinguish, to tell the difference between a lot of the noise that is being generated on social media and using some really complex event processing and algorithms or details that will help automate that so it's not so labor intensive that it takes weeks or months after the event looking at it for analysis. Is there anything happening on that front?
Anyone like to?
Want to go first? Yeah, I'll go for you. I'll go.
So Robin has a really good survey of the computer science world on this, and so she might, I'll leave it to her to answer the general question. I think there are a growing number of groups, individuals who are trying to do this. We're doing some of it at Colorado. It's very much in the research phase and not in a way that's deployable yet, which is a great regret. I wish we could move it along faster. So I do think it's happening. I think the NSF is continuing, or we want the NSF to continue to fund that very thing because it's such a difficult problem. And I know there are some others in this group who might also be able to specifically say the kinds of things they're doing as they're narrowing in on the particular attributes of that problem.
Sarah, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say that we're... So, mappers again, because we hit this problem all the time. We're actively going out and talking to small companies that are starting to build these tools. So I've just asked nicely if anyone can tell me what the tools we're looking at the moment are. I know we're talking to people like Leysia. I know we're involved in things like Swift River builds, and we've looked at a couple of other front-end natural language processors. We're also building some. They're the same as the academics. Can I ask a question too?
Well, I think Lauren had a really good point, is, but looking at crossing that boundary, social media is one aspect of what the entire report looked at. But based on my own personal experience, we're seeing a lot of advances in visualization, anything geolocative, correlational data mining of structured data. It can be heterogeneous, but it can be structured. A lot of interesting results in temporal reasoning over geolocative sets, as well as resilience. A lot of that's coming from the Department of Defense, and we're seeing two major barriers coming in. One is that, as you know, defense applications aren't nearly the same, no matter what some of the contractors think, as the same as public sector. And the other, is that they've got a high price on them. They want a lot of money for them. And so some of these things aren't things that can be, our market, what is low volume, low profit. And so there's existing industry solutions that are there. Then there's always the question of how does research make it through the hurdle to get into operationalized. So,
Eric, did you have a two-finger?
I did, just for a moment. I had a friend named Robert Kirkpatrick who used to argue while he was employed by Microsoft. Sorry. Robert Kirkpatrick, who's now at the UN Global Pulse Program, used to be at Microsoft, and he used to argue that in these discussions, please let the private sector take care of this. We will address this problem for you. We will take the research. We will commercialize it. We'll sell it back to you for cheap. Everybody will be happy. That isn't completely true. But one argument that can be made now for natural language processing, I was at DARPA for a number of years, and that was one of my programs. And we had recently the development of at least two, and there are probably more now that I don't know about, commercial programs. One is Buzz Manager out of North Carolina. The other is Radian 6. Radian 6 is the one that's been implemented at the American Red Cross Social Media Center. They don't seem to, I was over there, and if there's an ARC person here who can tell me better, I'd be interested to hear, but they weren't doing much with it when I was there. It was up, but not doing much analysis. Right. The Buzz Manager is considerably more sophisticated. It's actually used for sports media figures. So the tweets that are coming out about Shaquille O'Neal, Shaq pays money for them to track how is it going, how's the analysis, positive, negative, where's it trending, where's it not trending. So that's become a commercial system that's in use all the time and has quite a few subscribers, and they hold a lot of it proprietary, but it's buyable. So that's that commercial tension between something that appears to be successful and is giving value to consumers. They are paying for it. That's kind of the hallmark that we use in this society. But it is not something that is commercially available by and large to emergency services in people who are trying to reduce the volume of the analysis required on information coming in from a disaster.
Did we have another two-finger?
Yeah, I have a follow-up here. So I work in natural language processing. I'm Rob Munro, Idibon. First of all, I'll second what Eric Rasmussen said about letting the private sector take care of this. Natural language processing and machine learning is just kind of that level of complexity beyond what you would get in most very good engineers who are working with NGOs. It's something that you want to give to the private sector. In terms of published research, so I completed my PhD at Stanford University looking at just this problem. I was publishing this at the top natural language processing conferences. I was the only person publishing papers on this topic, which was really lonely. It's nice to come here. But I'm afraid that, more broadly, the answer is no. And it is a problem that's much broader and is being solved incrementally.
Sarah Jane?
Yeah, I've just got a quick answer back. We were using Geophedia, and we've been looking at a few of the other commercial offerings. Oh, sorry. Geophedia and OpenIR. There's a couple of things coming through that we're out talking to commercial groups on. We're also heavily trying to support the open source community, but as you said, quite often, both are. Actually, the question I had was, how do we find your research? We're on the sharp end trying to use this stuff all the time. How do we find you? Where do you hide out? All right, here. Fair enough.
Web search on our names.
yeah,
you know,
exactly.
Center for Ethics, Center for Emergency Informatics.
Just two of you. Is there a
Yeah,
space
just-
where
ju-
research is
I think
hiding?
that's something that we'll try to address.
If I can add to that, the ISCRAM conference has all of its proceedings since 10 years available, freely downloadable for you.
Comment on that.
I just wanted to comment. I'm Kim Stevens. Dr. Mark Cameron out of Australia has a paper called Emergency Situation Awareness from Twitter for Crisis Management. I tweeted it out, and it is a processing tool that they designed specifically with emergency managers in mind. They call it Emergency Situation Awareness Automated Web Text Mining System. They tested this with Australian State Emergency Services. What it does is when something happens and a keyword pops up, it sends an alert to the emergency services personnel. So even if they're not watching Twitter, they get an alert that something is happening that they should probably pay attention to. It does some similar things that Radian 6 does, but yet it's a little more tailored to emergency management versus the commercial products that are out there. So I just want to encourage everyone to look that up.
And to follow up on that is that what we've seen working with the responders and Disaster City, Texas A&M trains about 180,000 people a year from all 50 states and 40 countries, so we get a lot of feedback. And what we're seeing the problem with a lot of the things that in the social media is that we're not allowing the responders to put in what they're looking for, the emergency managers to tailor it. It's like, hey, we're going to tell you the keywords and then alert you, and then. But again, back to that idea of nonlinear wicked problems and stuff. You can't think of everything you would like to get alerted on. So once you have kind of a clue, you want to start, tell me about the water quality. Tell anything about salt. You know, I want to hear this. You know, weird stuff like that. And most of the systems break down because they don't allow the users or the consumer of the information to tailor it easily or rapidly enough. And if this is, that'd be great. Yeah, and that's great.
In the interest of time, do we have any one-finger questions? Yes.
I think it's a question and a comment. So I'm Luis Bermudez from the Open Geospatial Consortium. I think it's very good to think about this topic about how to better get the quality of the tweets, but also important is how do we are going to share that information, meaning if we're going to use the standards or not to share the provenance of the tweets or the provenance of the pixel data, how do we overlay these with traditional geospatial data? And how do we provide either the traditional geospatial resources in more unstructured ways or the other way around, how we structure these crowdsources data in services that are more common, easily to ingest by geospatial tools.
Anyone like to comment? I think the point's well taken. Leah, is there anything online?
No, our web is still down.
Ooh.
Actually, I'd like to ask, because Beasley has a Ustream account.
I'm trying to set it up.
We could get that set up.
Whoa. Okay.
But since I'm setting up that account, can I have a question?
Yeah.
Quid pro quo.
How can we, very often when I look at conference proceedings from the research community, I see a lot of great research, but it's not necessarily very applicable to real life. You know, there's great research on the use of 3G visualization of disaster situation, but let me tell you, we're never going to do any 3G in the field. How can we make what you're doing in the research field more applicable to what we need in the field? Okay, and how can we help guide you towards solving some of the more complex problems that we have not imaginary theoretical problems. I realize that everybody now knows that I'm not an academic, but
Well, I thought that was a pretty big statement from the National Science, for the community of computer scientists to say to the National Science Foundation, hey, don't fund anybody who says they're doing disaster response work if they can't show they've got a meaningful partnership with a stakeholder. So if you don't have somebody who knows something, if you're not working for someone like Jeff, or you're not working with an agency such as Dave, then that's a hard one for us to swallow. Also, the research agenda, there's lots of copies out here, please take them, I don't want to take them back, and PDFs online. But also the ability to test and have centers where you can bring people together for their work.
John?
Can I just add on to that too? Research that isn't grounded in real practice is a problem. You're absolutely right. But many of the people in this room who are researchers, Gisli, are grounded in the practice. And this is just and I think we design ourselves to be a part of that before we're researchers first. We want to make sure we're committed to that environment. Then when you have the numbers of us, maybe there aren't many, but there's more than just a couple. It's really hard, as much as I love these kind of venues, and I will keep going to them, and I completely support them, it's hard to share all of the research we've done in 5 minutes. And so we then, once it's complete, because we've been so careful about writing things down and explaining it, and we then need people to meet us the other halfway and just take a moment to maybe read them for the half an hour it might take, which I know, we'll keep speaking, we'll keep doing public speaking, we'll keep blogging on top of, and we'll keep coming to these things, but then the meat of it needs a little bit more time than that, and if you could read those, I think that would also help this conversation go back and forth. Sorry, I just have to say it.
Can I add to it? I think the discussion shows that there's a bit of sensitivity here on both, and I fully agree. And I fully agree with Leysia. I think it's a two-way communication problem. It's not only the research that are not grounded in reality or have difficulty in doing that, but also the other way around. How many practitioners really want to work with a scientist on their back, looking at them, what they do? It's much easier to continue what you've always done and say that you don't have any research there. But having said that, I'm very happy that Gisli and Jennifer will join me in a session next year on ISCRAM on particularly humanitarian information management. So we have the practitioners there, we have the academics, and that's the way to go. But it's an abyss sometimes between both worlds. And I've been struggling with ISCRAM for 10 years now to bridge that gap. And we're only slowly getting there.
I just want to emphasize that, I've not read your research, but I've read the research coming out of both the Tilburg and Colorado, and I really have to commend you on doing practical research. However, I'm saying is that the broader community is not looking at that practical thing. How do we get them to become more like what you guys are doing?
Incentives, this funding.
Two fingers back here.
That's right. It's always about incentives.
As someone who's trying to get their dissertation done right now, and who's been perpetually embarrassed to have Dan Swee and Mike Goodchild in the room as I talk, I think it's important to note that, at least from my perspective, I often find that my academic institution is as encumbered as the institution that I work for sometimes. Peer review, I think, is a good example. I have a paper that's been in review. Benson, my colleague's tired of hearing me talk about it because he's hearing me say, it's going to come out probably 10 times in the last year. So I think that there's a lag time with how we do research. And my paper's still under review. It always comes back, always comes back. It's going to be irrelevant by the time it comes out. So I think that we, as researchers and academics, also need to try and find new ways to break out of some of the old institutional structures that we work in that simply don't work for a field that's changing so quickly.
John?
This goes right into that question coming from Shadrach, is the tempo at which academic institutions work. not only do we have the issues of peer-reviewed journals, but many academic institutions are very averse to risk. They have, some cases, billions of dollars that they're managing. And in the process of trying to work with an area where disasters are inherently risky and they're sending staff to inherently risky places, getting even the permission to do the research is an enormous time lag. How do we begin to, how do we as academics remain relevant to the research question when we can't get in, and then once the research actually does take some time, and then on the other end we have the publication lag, and by then we're 3 generations behind in the technology?
Well, I'll respond quickly by saying I'm just glad to know that development isn't the only place where we've got this problem.
One more from the middle.
Oh, we've had,
Oh,
these two have been waiting
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So we're out of time, so I guess with Jen is the last one.
Go ahead.
Okay, go.
Just a quick question, and this is Kat Graham with Humanity Road. We had been studied for the empirical study that Leysia and Kate did in the past year and a half, 2 years. So we're very open to that. But I have a question in general. When we're working in a space that we know is a new emerging event, that we know is going to be valuable to be studied and collected that information, like the boots on the ground, we don't have time to put that together in a format that would be useful for a researcher. Where do we go to say, raise our hand and say, guess what, guys, we have something over here, somebody over there might want to jump in on this, and at least watch, monitor, and bring back those kind of results? How do we bring that to the research field?
Well, on an emergency response basis, like, I cannot. But the opportunity, right, to engage multiple communities, right, around the issue is really, as we've structured our approach to grand challenges for development, it's all around defining the problem. I found it incredibly hard working inside aid, talking to groups of experts to say, what's the problem? No, we've got to get bed nets out and we got to do this. No, I didn't ask what the solution was. What's the problem, right, that you're trying to solve? And it's really hard to articulate that. And so as practitioners, being able to be articulate about, look, this is what I can't do, or this, not, I need to be able to do, it's, where's the, break it down, get it narrow, get specific, and you'll find it's really hard to do, but once you've done it, it seems so obvious. Right, when you've done it well, because it's very specific and it's actionable.
I was hoping for a hashtag.
So was I.
I think NSF has a rapid response grant system, so that if something happens, you can apply rather quickly, for funding to study the disaster. And within this grant, we're working together with OCHA to send people with them if the opportunity is there.
Yeah, that rapid grant program was taking an average of 2 months for the Japan events. Right.
New
So
Zealand
they
was
had a
slower.
whole workshop about how rapid really didn't fit anybody's definition of rapid.
NSF's definition.
As another argument for federal funding, one of the things that we're saying here is that we need more researchers. We've got a set of researchers in the U.S. who work on this problem, but it's small and it's definitely finite. And so we're trying to grow as a crisis informatics research community. We're trying to grow people who can do these kinds of things in real ways. And so that is going to be another outcome of better funding by our federal agencies for this kind of research.
Okay, last 2 comments. First,
I
from
was
Jane.
just going to mention common curation. Your archives, our archives. So I know Leah's working on the bibliography for the space, which please everybody get in on there. And just again, it was a throwaway comment about where do we find your stuff, but that would be a start. Just being able to see your papers and links between your papers would be a good start. The other one is that Gisley's working on the data archives, because we keep getting enormous amounts of data, some very, very valuable data. Even things like our Skype chats, and we've had to build our own loggers so we can capture our own chats between our coordinations. But we can't keep losing this stuff. You need it to study, we need it to know where we've been. We also need to know where your studies are. It was just a chuck away comment, really.
Last comment.
Actually, I'll just
jump in there. Commons Lab did put together a bibliography. Leysia, all your papers are in there and cited. So if people go to our website, there's at least 280 records that our last research assistant put in, abstracts, authors, links to where you can find the papers.
Are they indexed for topic and so forth?
We set up a set of tags. It's still under development. If you have feedback, we'd love to hear it.
Can we help?
Yes.
Someone
Go ahead.
edited all these crumb papers. There.
So this has been such a really amazing conversation, and there's so many sort of small comments I have for everybody, and I hope that we'll have some time this evening over dinner or drinks to be able to talk about it more. One thing I just want to make a comment about and sort of reflection on is the challenges that, I'm a researcher, but I'm also a practitioner on two lines. I get deployed into humanitarian situations. I do post-emergency assessments. I do, and then I'm also a clinician in the emergency department. So whatever space I work in is complex, unstable, unanticipated. But as a researcher, there's a lot of challenges around trying to understand that. And I think we've heard a lot about that here, but how do we translate the stuff that we see as researchers into that practitioner space where it's a little bit different sometimes? And many of us, I think as somebody's mentioned, we live in both of those spaces and see those challenges and want to try to fix them. But a lot of it is about communications. I can read your journal, even as an academician. I can read your journal in whatever journal. Maybe I can access it, maybe I can't, and we can talk about that later. But I may not understand your equations. I may not understand your assumptions. Actually, the word for what you use as supply and demand may be very different from what I know in my field. So there's a basic communication issue. It's a cultural issue. So I think I want to just sort of pose to all of us is that how can we push forward the agenda in research with funding, with ourselves, with practitioners, in the research around implementation? And I think we're all kind of delving into it. But that could be just formalized research. It could be simulation spaces that we work together and try to figure out what you meant in that paper when we're doing the implementation phase together. It's about experiments in different spaces, because I think if we can push forward the methodologies to do that, the process, the design of how to do that, then actually we'll create a really great space for formalized research that we need for some of us for tenure, some of us not for tenure, but also for practitioners to be able to begin to learn, not only from our articles and from our conferences and our proceedings, but by actually the face-to-face spaces that we can get through implementation spaces and experimentation.
Any responses to us from the panel?
Fully agree.
Fully agree. Okay, I think we need to.
Yes, so this is actually a great segue to the very last and best session of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Sorry. Well, Bart, you're on that panel.
Well then.
Aren't you? Oh, no, so maybe not. No, you were. So research to operations. Here in D.C., we call that the Valley of Death.
But before that, an even bigger round of applause for this panel.
Oh, yeah.